You saved my child. According to our ancestors' law, you are now my husband." Daniel had not planned to stop in the village. He was supposed to pass through before sunset and reach the main road by night. The map on his phone showed only a thin line where the road should be, and the signal had disappeared hours ago. Still, he kept walking, trusting his instincts the way he always did when things went off plan. He had learned, through years of travel and volunteer work, that plans rarely survived reality. The village appeared quietly, almost suddenly. Small clay houses stood close together, their walls the color of dry earth. Smoke rose from cooking fires and goats wandered freely between homes. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. It felt calm, untouched by time, as if the world here moved at a slower pace. Daniel slowed down. He didn't want to draw attention, but it was impossible not to be noticed. He was taller than most of the villagers, lighter-skinned, carrying a worn backpack and wearing clothes that clearly did not belong to this place. A few people stopped what they were doing to look at him. Their faces were not hostile, just curious. He raised a hand in greeting and offered a small smile. A man nodded back. "Ah." A woman pulled her child closer. Life went on. Daniel decided to rest near the edge of the village. He found a flat rock by the river, which flowed fast and wide just beyond the homes. The water was loud, powerful, and brown from recent rain. He drank from his bottle and sat down, letting the sound calm his thoughts. He had been traveling for months, moving from place to place, helping where he could, repairing roofs, teaching basic first aid, translating for aid groups. He never stayed long. Attachment made leaving harder, and leaving was part of the life he had chosen. He watched the river for a while. A group of children were playing nearby, throwing small stones into the water and cheering when they skipped across the surface. An older woman called out to them, warning them not to get too close. The children laughed and pretended to listen. Daniel smiled faintly. He had seen this scene in many places. Children were the same everywhere. Curious, fearless, unaware of danger until it was too late. The moment happened fast. 1 second, a small boy stood near the riverbank, crouched low, reaching for a stick floating near the edge. The next second, the ground beneath his feet crumbled. The rain had weakened the soil. The boy slipped, his arms flailing, and then he was gone, pulled into the river by the force of the water. For half a heartbeat, the world froze. Then the village erupted. A sharp scream cut through the air. "Ah!" My child. Daniel was already on his feet. He didn't think. He didn't pause to consider the speed of the water or the danger. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He dropped his backpack and ran. The river was stronger than it looked. The current dragged the boy under, spinning him like a leaf. The child surfaced for a second, coughing, his small hands reaching for nothing. His eyes were wide with terror. Daniel jumped. The cold hit him like a wall. The water pulled at his clothes, heavy and violent. He swam hard, fighting the current instead of letting it carry him away. He remembered his training. Angle your body, move with the water, don't panic. The boy surfaced again, farther down. Daniel pushed harder, his muscles burning. He reached out just as the child slipped beneath the surface once more. This time, Daniel dove under, eyes open despite the sting, searching desperately. He saw the boy's shirt waving in the water like a flag. Daniel grabbed him and kicked upward with everything he had left. They broke the surface together. The boy coughed and cried weakly, clinging to Daniel's neck. Daniel wrapped one arm around him and turned toward the shore. Villagers were running along the bank now, shouting, pointing. Someone threw a rope into the water, but it fell short. Daniel kept moving, his legs shaking, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Finally, his feet touched ground. Strong hands grabbed them both and pulled them out. The boy was placed gently on the earth. He was alive, shaking, coughing, crying, but alive. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the river and the boy's uneven breathing. Then the mother reached in. Amina dropped to her knees beside her child, her hands trembling as she touched his face, his arms, his chest, as if checking to make sure he was real. Tears streamed down her face. She pulled him into her arms and held him tightly, rocking back and forth, whispering words Daniel did not understand. Daniel sat on the ground, soaked, exhausted, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. Someone handed him a cloth. Someone else touched his shoulder. Faces surrounded him, filled with shock, relief, and something deeper. Something heavy. He didn't notice at first. He was too focused on catching his breath, too focused on the fact that the boy was alive. That was enough. That was always enough. But as he stood up, wringing water from his sleeves, he felt the shift in the air. The murmurs were different now. People were not just thanking him. They were speaking in low, serious voices. Elders had arrived, older men with lined faces and steady eyes. They looked at the child, then at Amina, then at Daniel. Their gaze lingered on him longer than felt comfortable. Amina finally looked up. Her eyes met Daniel's. They were dark, wide, still filled with fear. But beneath that was something else. Confusion, shock, and a growing realization that made her grip on her child tighten. She stood slowly, never letting go of her son. She stepped toward Daniel, stopping just a few feet away. For a long moment, she said nothing. Daniel smiled gently, trying to reassure her. He pointed to the boy and gave a thumbs up, hoping the gesture would translate. "He's okay," he said softly. Amina nodded, but her face did not relax. She spoke to one of the elders in a quick, tense voice. The elder responded calmly, with a firmness that made her shoulders slump slightly, as if she already knew what he would say. Daniel sensed that something was wrong. An older woman approached and placed a shawl over Daniel's shoulders. Her hands lingered for a second, almost respectfully. She said something to him, her tone kind but serious. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the weight behind them. He looked around, hoping to find someone who spoke his language. Is the child all right?" he asked again, louder this time. A younger man nodded. "Yes, alive because of you." "Ah." Daniel exhaled, relieved. "Good. That's good." The young man hesitated, then glanced at the elders before speaking again. "You saved her son."
"Yes," Daniel said simply.
"Anyone would have." The man shook his head. "Not anyone." Amina was speaking again now, her voice shaking, and she held her child close, his face pressed against her shoulder. The elders listened carefully. One of them nodded slowly, as if confirming a truth already known. Then the eldest stepped forward and looked directly at Daniel. His eyes were calm but serious. He spoke slowly, clearly, as if every word mattered. Daniel did not understand the language, but he understood the silence that followed. Everyone was watching him. The elder placed a hand over his own chest, then gestured toward the child, then toward Amina. Finally, he pointed at Daniel. The meaning was not clear yet, but the feeling was. Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. This was no longer just about a rescue. Amina lowered her gaze. Her grip on her child tightened once more. Her lips trembled, not with grief this time, but with something like fear of what came next. Daniel stood there, wet clothes clinging to his skin, the river still roaring behind him, unaware that a single act of instinct had just tied his life to this village in a way he never could have imagined. The day after, the rescue began quietly, but Daniel quickly realized that nothing about this village was simple. He had expected gratitude, maybe a few words of thanks, maybe some smiles. Instead, he found himself at the center of whispers, curious glances and conversations he could not understand. The villagers did not treat him like a visitor. They treated him like someone who had crossed an invisible line he did not yet know existed. Amina did not speak to him directly that morning. She stayed close to her child, brushing his hair, wiping his face, and murmuring words Daniel could not comprehend. The child, still trembling from the river, clung to her like a tiny shadow, occasionally glancing at Daniel with wide, cautious eyes. Daniel felt an unfamiliar sense of responsibility. He had saved the boy, yes, but that was supposed to be the end of it. Now, he realized, it had only just begun. By mid-morning, the elders of the village had gathered again. They approached Daniel slowly, moving with a solemn weight. The oldest among them, a man with skin weathered by decades under the sun, spoke first. His words were firm, his tone unyielding, and though Daniel did not understand them, he could sense the gravity behind each syllable. The younger villagers whispered to one another, eyes flicking between Daniel and Amina, as if waiting for something monumental to unfold. Amina stepped forward, still holding her son, her eyes searching Daniel's for understanding. She was silent at first, but then she spoke in a low voice. The elders nodded at her words, their faces unreadable. Daniel could feel the tension in the air. Something serious was happening, something far beyond the ordinary gratitude he had expected. Finally, the eldest approached him, placing a hand over his heart, then gesturing toward Amina and the boy, and finally pointing directly at Daniel. His gaze was steady, almost commanding. Daniel tried to speak. I saved your son. That's all. Nothing more. But the elder shook his head slowly. His eyes were firm, not unkind, but unmovable. Daniel realized with a shock he could not hide that this was not a discussion. This was a declaration of law, of tradition, of a code older than he could imagine. The villagers, sensing his hesitation, stepped closer, forming a quiet circle around him, their faces serious. Amina's voice trembled as she spoke again. Daniel noticed the pain in her eyes, the way her hands tightened around her son. He had saved her child, yes, but now he understood that saving him had bound him to something he could not yet name. He did not know what to do, how to respond, or even if he should respond. His heart raced, a mixture of fear, confusion, and growing anxiety he had never felt before. One of the younger villagers stepped forward and spoke in broken English, enough for Daniel to understand some words. Here, we have law, old law. You save child, you protector, wife. Daniel blinked. He repeated the words in his mind. Protector, wife? He felt the blood rush from his head. I don't understand. What do you mean? The young man gestured toward Amina, then back to Daniel. His tone was insistent, as if he had to make Daniel understand. Our law, old law. When someone saves child, you must didsai. You must be husband, protector, family. Daniel could not believe what he was hearing. A husband? He had just saved a child. He was not here to marry anyone. He had never even met Amina before today. His mind raced, searching for some way to explain, to refuse, to escape. But the elders were watching, unblinking. Amina was watching, her eyes wide, her hands clutching her son as though holding him tighter could somehow make the law disappear. Daniel swallowed hard.
I don't know your law, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I can't do that.
I'm not. This is impossible. The eldest shook his head slowly, deliberately. He spoke again in the local language. The younger villager translated as best he could. Law's not choice. Law is protection. Child is life. You saved life. Now, duty. You are protector. You are family. Ancestors watch. Ancestors decide. Daniel's heart pounded. Ancestors. Duty. He had never thought of himself as part of something so ancient, so unchangeable. In his world, saving someone's life ended with relief and gratitude. Here, it began with responsibility, a responsibility that tied him to a woman and child he barely knew. He looked at Amina, expecting fear, anger, maybe disbelief, but her face was unreadable. Her eyes were wide, but there was something else. Acceptance, perhaps, or resignation. She was bound by this law, just as he was now. The child squirmed in her arms, clutching her neck, sensing the tension in the air. Daniel wanted to say something, to explain, to reason, but no words came. The elders spoke again, this time directing their attention to Amina. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. Daniel realized she was acknowledging the law, the tradition, even if her heart did not fully agree. He felt a pang of sympathy. He did not want this. She did not want this. And yet, the law was stronger than both of them. For hours, they discussed what should happen next. Daniel learned small pieces of the law through gestures and broken translation. The child's safety was now his responsibility. He must provide support and protection, and most importantly, his connection to Amina was now formalized by tradition. The words husband and family were repeated over and over, leaving no room for argument. Daniel tried to reason. There has to be another way, he said. I didn't ask for this. I saved a life, yes, but marriage? That's not fair. The elders shook their heads. Fairness is not measured by desire. Life is preserved by law. Law is oldest. Law is protection. You saved life. You accept life. You accept duty. Daniel felt his legs weaken. He had faced danger before. Storms, floods, illnesses, but this was different. This was not physical danger. This was a test of his morality, his understanding, his willingness to bend to a tradition he could barely comprehend. He wanted to escape, to run, but he knew deep down that running would not solve anything. He was already tied to this village, to this woman, to this child. Amina approached him slowly. The child pressed his face against her chest. She spoke quietly, words he did not understand, then gestured toward him and the child. The gesture was clear enough. She was giving him a choice, or perhaps not. Perhaps she was merely acknowledging the law that bound them both. Daniel's mind raced. He thought of his life before this moment. Travels, work, freedom, solitude. All of it seemed distant now, irrelevant. He thought of the child, of the boy's small hands and frightened eyes, and of Amina, standing with quiet dignity. He realized, with a sudden clarity, that no argument, no reasoning, no explanation could change what had already happened. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Villagers continued their work, but Daniel could feel their eyes on him. He was part of their world now, whether he wanted it or not. He helped where he could, carrying water, assisting with small repairs, offering guidance when asked, but the weight of the law, the unspoken bond, pressed on him constantly. As evening fell, Daniel found himself sitting by the river again, the same spot where he had rescued the child. The water was calmer now, reflecting the pink and orange of the setting sun. He thought of everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. One instinctive act of courage had changed his life forever. One moment of human kindness had turned into a lifelong responsibility he had never asked for. Amina approached him, holding the child. She sat down across from him, a quiet understanding between them. No words were spoken at first. They simply watched the river, letting the silence stretch, letting the reality of their new life settle over them like the evening sky. Finally, she spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Law," she said. That was all he needed to hear. He nodded, realizing he could no longer argue, could no longer resist. The law of this village, the law of ancestors, had decided. He had been chosen, not by desire, not by chance, but by the actions of a single, unplanned moment. Daniel took a deep breath, looking at the child, then at Amina. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, how he would navigate this life, or whether he would ever truly belong here. But he understood one thing clearly. His life had changed, forever bound to this small village, to this woman, and to the child whose life he had saved. And in that quiet moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the river whispered its ancient song, Daniel realized that courage, compassion, and duty were not just acts, they were choices, and sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that came without warning. He did not yet know if he was ready for the days ahead, but he knew one thing. He could not turn back. He could not undo what had been done. The law of the ancestors had spoken, and Daniel, whether he wanted it or not, had to listen. The days that followed were not easy for Daniel. The village moved at a slow, deliberate pace, guided by tradition and the quiet rhythm of life that had existed for generations. Daniel, however, was not used to such a pace. In his world, decisions were made quickly, schedules were strict, and personal choice mattered more than ancient law. Here, choice seemed almost irrelevant. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of the elders' eyes on him. Even the children, who had once run freely and laughed, now watched him carefully. He understood that they were learning too, that the man who saved their friend was no longer just a stranger. He was now part of their lives in a way that could not be undone. Amina kept to herself mostly. She moved silently through the day, carrying her son, preparing food, tending to the small garden behind her home. Sometimes she would glance at Daniel, and their eyes would meet for a brief, silent moment. He would offer a small nod or smile, but she rarely returned it. There was a tension between them that neither could fully explain, a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and the invisible bonds of the law that had brought them together. One morning, Daniel awoke to find Amina standing outside his small shelter, the child clinging to her skirts. She gestured for him to follow. He hesitated for a moment, unsure what she wanted, but the look in her eyes left no room for argument. He followed her through the narrow paths of the village, past mud brick houses, over uneven stones, and finally to a small clearing near the edge of the forest. There, a group of villagers had gathered. Elders, men and women, all stood quietly waiting. Daniel's stomach tightened. He could feel that something serious was about to happen. Amina stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was calm, but Daniel could hear the undercurrent of emotion: fear, concern, and perhaps a little anger. The villagers listened attentively. The eldest man stepped forward. He looked at Daniel directly, his expression serious but not unkind. This time Daniel could sense the full weight of their tradition. The law was clear. By saving the child, he had taken on responsibilities that could not be ignored. He was expected not only to protect the boy, but also to support Amina, to become part of her family, and to act as her husband in every sense that mattered to their community. Daniel's mind raced. This is too much, he said, his voice tight. I'm not ready for any of this. I don't know your customs fully, and I've never even been married before. The elder raised a hand to silence him. Words were spoken in the local language, and then the young man who had translated before repeated them in broken English. Law is oldest. Life is protected by law.
You cannot leave. Duty is your path.
Ancestors see. Ancestors guide. Daniel felt his heart sink. He had faced danger before, he reminded himself, but this was different. This was not a storm or a flood. This was human expectation, tradition, and a law older than he could imagine, binding him to a woman and child he barely knew. Over the next several days, Daniel tried to adapt. He helped Amina with daily chores, carried water from the river, repaired small things around her home, and even assisted in the garden. At first, it felt mechanical, like he was performing tasks to satisfy the villagers' expectations rather than acting from genuine care. But as he observed Amina's strength, her quiet determination, and the careful attention she gave her child, something inside him began to shift. He began to see that his actions were not just about following law, they were about supporting a family, keeping a child safe, and offering stability in a world that could sometimes feel unpredictable and harsh. Despite this growing understanding, tension remained. Amina, though polite and sometimes warm, kept her distance. She would answer his questions with short responses and rarely initiated conversation. Daniel felt the weight of this silence more heavily than any worded argument. He realized that saving a child and following the law did not automatically create trust or familiarity. It was something that had to be built patiently, day by day. One afternoon, a small accident reminded Daniel of the fragility of their situation. The child, playful and energetic despite the river incident, had wandered too close to the edge of the water while Daniel was carrying a basket of fruit back from the garden. Before Daniel could react, the boy stumbled and fell, screaming. Daniel's heart leapt into his throat. He dropped the basket and ran, scooping the child into his arms just as Amina arrived, her face pale and fearful. She did not speak at first. She simply held the child, rocking him back and forth while he cried. Daniel stood nearby, feeling helpless despite his protective instincts. It was in that moment he realized something important. His presence alone could not erase fear, nor could it replace the mother's love. But it could provide safety, reassurance, and strength. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel sat outside the small shelter, tired but thoughtful. Amina joined him, sitting across from him with the child resting against her side. For the first time, she spoke more than a few words. Her English was limited, but her meaning was clear. She asked him why he had risked his life for her child, why he had acted without hesitation. Daniel considered his answer carefully. Because he was a child, he said softly. Anyone could have been hurt. Anyone could have drowned. I couldn't just stand by. It was instinct, I guess. And I didn't want him to die. Amina listened, her dark eyes studying his face. She nodded slowly, as if trying to reconcile his words with the law that now bound them together. You saved him, and now you are bound, she said quietly. Our ancestors, they do not forget. They do not forgive. Daniel felt the weight of those words. Bound, ancestors, duty. Ah, he had wanted to act freely, to make choices for himself. Now he understood that in this village, one action could create obligations that lasted far beyond any single moment. Over the next week, Daniel began to notice subtle shifts. Villagers who had been distant and cautious now looked at him with a mixture of respect and expectation. Children ran to greet him, curious but wary. Amina's neighbors observed their interactions closely, some nodding in approval, others whispering behind hands. Daniel understood that his actions were being measured, judged, and incorporated into the community's understanding of family and duty. One afternoon, Daniel accompanied Amina and the child to the small market at the edge of the village. He had never seen anything like it. Stalls made of wood and cloth sold fruits, vegetables, grains, and handmade goods. People bartered and chatted, the air filled with noise and laughter. Yet Daniel felt the eyes of the village on him, even here. Every step he took was observed, every gesture noted. He realized that life in the village was not just about survival. It was about community, law, and the unspoken rules that governed every interaction. He also realized that he had to adapt if he wanted to coexist peacefully, not only for his own sake, but for Amina and the child. As the days passed, Daniel's understanding of his role grew deeper. He was not just a helper or a visitor. He was now a protector, a provider, and, by the law of the ancestors, a husband. The word itself still felt foreign, heavy with responsibility he had never anticipated. Yet, he began to see it not as a trap, but as a framework that could guide him. Still, the tension between him and Amina lingered. There were moments of awkward silence, moments of misunderstanding, and moments when he wondered if she truly accepted him. He tried to respect her space, to allow her to lead when necessary, and to follow quietly when the situation demanded it. He learned to observe, to listen, and to act thoughtfully rather than impulsively. One evening, a storm approached. Rain poured down and the river swelled again. Daniel, without thinking, helped Amina secure their shelter and ensured the child was safe. He worked quickly, efficiently, without complaint. After the storm passed, Amina looked at him, and for the first time, Daniel saw something like gratitude in her eyes. Not the formal gratitude of law, but the quiet, human gratitude that comes from being protected and cared for. That night, Daniel lay awake, thinking about the days that had passed. He understood that saving a life had changed everything. Not because of gratitude or reward, but because one act of courage had consequences beyond imagination. He thought of Amina, the child, and the village that had embraced him in ways he had not yet fully understood. He realized that the path ahead would not be simple. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt, yet there would also be moments of connection, small victories, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he was making a difference. Daniel closed his eyes and let the sounds of the village lull him into a restless sleep, aware that his life, once free and unbound, was now deeply intertwined with the law, the people, and the child whose life he had saved. And in the quiet of the night, he understood something profound. Sometimes the greatest challenges come not from danger or fear, but from responsibility, trust, and the courage to accept a life that fate has handed you. The day of the marriage arrived with a quiet intensity that Daniel had never experienced before. In his life, weddings had always been celebrations, colorful, loud, full of music and dancing. Here, however, it was different. The ceremony was solemn, steeped in tradition, and guided by the elders who watched every movement with careful attention. Daniel could feel the weight of expectation pressing on him like the heat of the midday sun. Amina stood apart, her son holding her hand tightly. Her face was calm, but Daniel could see the tension in her eyes, the way her shoulders were rigid, and the slight tremor in her hands. She had accepted the law, yes, but acceptance did not erase fear, confusion, or the uncertainty of marrying a stranger, even one who had saved her child's life. The elders began the ritual, their chants soft but powerful, echoing through the small clearing where the villagers had gathered. Daniel watched, trying to understand every gesture, every word, even though he could not speak the language fluently. One of the younger villagers translated as best he could. He explained that this ceremony was not just about marriage, it was about creating a bond, a promise of protection, respect, and responsibility. It was about recognizing the act of saving a life and ensuring that the child would always be cared for. Daniel's heart pounded. He had never felt so exposed, so scrutinized, and so aware of the consequences of every small action. He glanced at Amina, who met his gaze for a brief moment. In her eyes, he saw something he did not expect: trust. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He realized that despite the strangeness of the situation, despite the weight of law and tradition, she was placing a part of her life in his hands. The ceremony moved forward. Daniel and Amina were asked to perform simple acts of unity, lighting a small flame together, sharing a few words of promise in the local language, exchanging symbolic gifts. Each gesture felt heavy with meaning. Yet Daniel tried to follow instructions carefully. He watched as Amina repeated the gestures, her hands steady despite the tension in her face. Her son looked on, curious and alert, sensing the importance of the day even if he did not fully understand it. After the formal parts of the ceremony, the elders spoke directly to Daniel. They explained that his duties now extended beyond simple protection. He was expected to participate in the life of the family, to support Amina emotionally and practically, and to be present as a father figure for the child. They reminded him that leaving would not only dishonor the law but also place the family at risk. Daniel nodded silently, absorbing the enormity of their words. As the ceremony ended, the villagers began to retreat to their homes, leaving Daniel and Amina alone in the small clearing with the child. Daniel's mind was spinning. He had anticipated gratitude, maybe curiosity, but he had never imagined the depth of responsibility that tradition demanded. He felt as though a lifetime of decisions had been handed to him in a single day, and he was expected to act as if nothing had changed. Amina spoke first, her voice low but clear. You must help him grow. You must protect him. And you must be patient. Daniel looked at her, unsure how to respond. Patience was something he had always considered a virtue, but now it felt like a requirement for survival. I will, he said finally, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. I will do my best. I don't know if it will be enough, but I will try. Amina nodded slowly, and for a moment, a fragile sense of understanding passed between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of trust, a recognition that they were bound together not by choice, but by necessity, and that necessity required cooperation, respect, and care. The following days were challenging. Daniel tried to adapt to the routines of village life while learning the expectations of his new role. He woke early to help with chores, carried water, assisted with cooking, and worked to repair the small shelter they shared. He watched carefully, learning the subtleties of behavior, understanding that his actions were constantly observed and evaluated. Amina remained cautious. She appreciated Daniel's efforts, but was careful not to rely on him more than necessary. She had lived independently for years, raising her child alone, and surrendering any control over her life, even partially, was difficult. Yet she could not deny that his presence brought safety and stability, something that the child needed, and something she had longed for in quiet moments of exhaustion. The child, for his part, was wary at first. He had only known his mother and the small routines of their life before Daniel arrived. Now he watched the man who had saved him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Sometimes he would cling to Amina, refusing to leave her side. Other times he would glance at Daniel, slowly testing the waters, trying to understand whether this stranger could truly be trusted. Daniel approached these moments with care. He did not force interaction, did not demand affection or recognition. Instead, he allowed small gestures to build trust. A smile, a gentle word, a helping hand when the child struggled with chores or play. Slowly, over the course of several days, the child began to respond, offering shy smiles, soft laughter, and tentative attempts at conversation. One afternoon, while helping the child collect fruit from a low-hanging branch, Daniel realized how much he had begun to care. The child's laughter, light and pure, filled the space between them, bridging the distance that words could not. Amina watched quietly from a distance, and Daniel sensed her approval, not spoken, but expressed through the subtle nods and relaxed posture that showed she trusted him in ways she could not yet articulate. Despite these small victories, tension remained. Daniel often found himself frustrated by the slow pace, the unspoken rules, and the cultural expectations that he could not fully grasp. Amina, too, struggled with the new reality. She was polite, cooperative, and careful, but Daniel could sense her unease. She had accepted the law, yes, but acceptance did not erase the anxiety, the loss of independence, or the uncertainty about what the future held. One evening, after the chores were done and the child had fallen asleep, Daniel and Amina sat outside their shelter. The air was cool, the sky painted with stars, and for the first time since the marriage, they spoke openly. "You saved him," Amina said quietly. "I do not forget that. But now life changes. You must understand this is not easy for me." Daniel nodded. "I know. And I don't expect you to feel differently overnight. I don't even know how I feel sometimes. But I will try. I want to help. I want to be here. For both of you." Amina studied him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time. "We must learn. We must see if this life can work. Eyes. For him. For us." Daniel exhaled, relieved that she was willing to communicate, even if cautiously. "I will do whatever I can. I promise." The days turned into weeks. Daniel began to understand the rhythm of the village, the small tasks that mattered, and the importance of observation and respect. He learned that his role was not only to act, but to watch, to listen, and to anticipate needs before they became urgent. He also began to notice changes in himself. He had always traveled lightly, avoiding deep connections, keeping his life simple and mobile. Now he felt a strange satisfaction in routine, a growing sense of responsibility that gave his days meaning. Caring for Amina and the child was no longer a duty imposed by law. It was becoming a part of him, a quiet thread that wove through his thoughts. shaping his decisions and his actions. Amina, too, began to shift. She remained cautious, but she allowed small moments of trust to develop. She would sometimes smile at Daniel when he helped the child, or offer a quiet word of thanks when he completed a difficult task. She observed him closely, noting his sincerity, his patience, and his willingness to adapt. Slowly, the distance between them narrowed, not through words, but through shared experience, mutual care, and the quiet understanding that they were now bound together, not only by law, but by circumstance, necessity, and emerging trust. One afternoon, a minor emergency tested their bond. The child had climbed a tree to retrieve a fruit and had slipped, dangling precariously from a branch. Daniel acted quickly, scaling the tree and securing the child safely in his arms. Amina rushed to help, her heart pounding with fear. Afterward, she held the child close, her gaze meeting Daniel's with a mixture of relief and gratitude. No words were spoken, but in that moment, an unspoken understanding formed. Daniel realized that life in this village was not just about survival or duty. It was about trust, care, and connection. The small moments that built a life together, brick by brick, day by day. By the end of the month, Daniel, Amina, and the child had begun to form a fragile, careful family. It was not perfect, nor was it easy, but it was real. Each day brought small victories, moments of understanding, and the quiet reassurance that they could face challenges together. Daniel knew the journey ahead would continue to be difficult. There would be misunderstandings, frustrations, and moments of doubt, but he also understood that this was life, not a life of choice or convenience, but a life of responsibility, compassion, and commitment. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a quiet, steady certainty. He was where he needed to be. The days had grown longer, but in a different way than Daniel had ever known. He no longer measured time by schedules or deadlines, but by the rhythm of village life, the rising sun over the clay rooftops, the laughter of the child as he chased goats, the soft hum of conversation between neighbors, and the steady work that kept life moving. It was a life of routines, small victories, and challenges, and Daniel found himself growing into it without even realizing it. Yet, despite the growing sense of belonging, a question weighed on him constantly. What if this was all temporary? What if his life outside the village, with freedom and mobility, called him back? He thought of the world he had left behind, the cities, the volunteers he had worked with, the roads he had traveled, and a longing tugged at him. He had chosen this path through instinct, saving a child, but had he chosen to stay? That choice had never been his to make. Amina sensed his hesitation. She watched him quietly, studying his expressions, the way he moved, the way he responded to their daily challenges. She understood the conflict inside him. She had felt it herself, in the way the law had tied her to a stranger. For weeks, she had tried not to show it, keeping her emotions carefully balanced. But she also realized that the family they were building, fragile and careful as it was, depended on more than duty. It depended on trust, mutual respect, and the willingness to be present. One evening, Daniel found Amina sitting outside, the child asleep in her arms. She gestured for him to sit beside her. The air was cool, filled with the smell of wet earth after a passing shower. The village was quiet now, lights flickering softly from small homes, and the river murmured gently in the distance. "You think," she began slowly, her words hesitant, "about leaving?" Daniel paused. He had thought of it often, but hearing it aloud made it real. "I do," he admitted. "Not because I want to abandon you or him, but because this life, it's not what I expected. I've never known a life like this. It's beautiful in a way, but it's different from what I've known. I don't know if I can stay." Amina nodded, her eyes reflecting both understanding and sorrow. "I know. The law, it binds us, yes, but the heart must choose. If you stay only out of duty, it will not be enough. You must want it. And we cannot force you." Daniel felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had acted instinctively once, diving into the river to save a child. That decision had changed his life, binding him to a woman and a boy he barely knew. But now, for the first time, he realized that staying would have to come from his own choice, not law, not obligation, not tradition. He looked at Amina, at the child sleeping against her chest, and felt a deep, quiet stirring in his heart. He had grown to care for them, not out of duty alone, but because of shared moments, quiet understandings, and the small daily acts that built connection. He had watched the boy laugh for the first time since the river, watched him trust him enough to climb a tree, watched him learn, grow, and feel safe. And he had seen Amina's strength, her patience, and her unwavering commitment to her child. "I don't want to leave," he said finally, his voice steady. "Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because I've come to care for both of you. Because this family is important to me, more than I realized." Amina's eyes softened, a smile breaking through the tension that had lingered for so long. "Then you stay," she said simply. "Not because the law says so, but because you choose." For the first time, the village's law and human emotion aligned, not as obligation, but as genuine connection. Daniel felt a sense of relief he could not describe. It was not just freedom from choice imposed by tradition. It was freedom to love, protect, and belong without constraint. The following weeks marked a new chapter. Daniel became more involved in the village life, not as an outsider or a visitor, but as part of a family that mattered. He and Amina began to share more than tasks. They shared stories, meals, laughter, and quiet conversations. The child began to see Daniel not just as a protector, but as a father figure, seeking his guidance, his reassurance, and his presence in ways that warmed Daniel's heart. One morning, Daniel woke early and walked with the child to the river. The boy had grown braver, more confident. He splashed water with laughter, pointing to small fish darting beneath the surface. Daniel smiled, remembering the day he had saved him. That moment, once so frightening, now felt like the beginning of everything. Amina joined them soon after, carrying a small basket of fruit. She watched quietly as Daniel lifted the boy into his arms, spinning him around until the child's laughter echoed across the water. She felt a strange, quiet happiness, something she had not known she could feel since the river incident. There was trust now, built over weeks of shared life and an unspoken understanding that they could face whatever came next together. Life was not perfect. There were still challenges. The river could be dangerous, the work of the village was hard, and there were moments of miscommunication and misunderstanding. But Daniel no longer saw these as obstacles. They were opportunities to care, to learn, and to grow. Each day strengthened the bond between them, not because tradition demanded it, but because human hearts had chosen it. One afternoon, the elders visited them. They came not to impose law, but to observe, to ensure that the family was thriving and that Daniel's choice to stay was genuine. They spoke in the local language, and the younger villager translated. "You have accepted duty," he said, "but now you have chosen life. Ancestors see this. They are pleased." Daniel felt a wave of relief and quiet pride. It was no longer about obligation, fear, or law. It was about choice, care, and mutual respect. Amina nodded quietly, and for the first time, their bond felt balanced. They were partners, not by tradition alone, but by willingness, by shared experience, and by the care they offered one another. The child, who had once cried in fear, now ran to Daniel with a laugh, hugging his legs, asking him to play. Daniel lifted him up, spinning him in the air, and felt an emotion he had never expected: pure joy, tinged with the satisfaction of belonging, of having a place in the world that was bigger than himself. Evenings became moments of quiet reflection. Daniel and Amina would sit outside, watching the sun dip below the horizon. They would speak softly, sharing dreams, hopes, and fears. They would sometimes laugh at small mistakes, and sometimes sit in silence, simply enjoying the presence of one another. The child would fall asleep nearby, secure in the knowledge that both of his parents, by law and by choice, were there for him. Daniel thought often of the river. He remembered the fear, the urgency, the instinctive leap that had started everything. What had begun as a single act of courage had evolved into a life he had never imagined, one filled with responsibility, love, and the quiet beauty of daily life. He realized that true courage was not only in facing danger, but in choosing to stay, to care, and to build a life that mattered. Amina, too, felt the shift. She had accepted the law out of necessity, but now she accepted Daniel for who he was. She had seen his patience, his sincerity, and his willingness to adapt to a life so different from his own. She had felt his care for her child and for her, and slowly she allowed herself to hope, not just for safety or duty, but for happiness, companionship, and perhaps even love. One day, as they walked together through the village, the child running ahead, Daniel looked at Amina and smiled. She smiled back, a quiet, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was a small moment, but it carried everything they had been building together: trust, connection, and the choice to be a family. The villagers watched them, not with scrutiny this time, but with quiet respect. They saw a man who had followed the law, but more importantly, they saw a man who had chosen to care. They saw a woman who had accepted her fate, but more importantly, they saw a woman who had found partnership, strength, and hope. And they saw a child growing up safe, loved, and cherished. A life saved not just in the river, but in the heart of a family. Daniel understood, finally, that life was not about control or certainty. It was about courage, care, and choice. It was about recognizing responsibility and embracing it, even when it was unexpected or frightening.